Hey everybody, hope that everybody's doing well and back for video workshop number two. I know there's still some questions actually hanging out there, if you will, after our first, excuse me, our first video workshop, and I will be answering those very soon. I know there's also some questions from the My Utopia. It's just been a crazy first week, after my travels across the country and then back, and then I mean, it's usually this way. Students coming in and out of the class and getting students situated with, new students who are coming into the class situated. Um, so I apologize for not quite answering all those questions in the immediate, but I will definitely be getting to them. I might even put them all together and then provide all the answers kind of in a because a lot of people have similar questions, and provide all those maybe in a single, you know, FAQ post or something like that. So, without further ado, what we're doing with this video workshop is talking about narrative strategies. As you well know, I cruelly had you guys dive right in and try to write a very first, very, very rough draft of a narrative. And the goal behind that was just to sort of, yes, put you on the horse and say, go for it and see what you already know. Um, hopefully, in hopefully, in some ways, you ran into some challenges, into some struggles. If you didn't run into any challenges or struggles with writing a personal narrative, much less writing anything, I would be very surprised. Now, it's not that, of course, that I want you all to suffer. I don't, absolutely not. But we can learn a lot from those challenges. And so we also now have something to build from in terms of that moment of disruption post. If you want to continue with what you did in that post and build upon that as working towards the essay, then you're welcome to do that. If you want to completely change, do something totally different, or do something slightly different, you're welcome to do that as well. You're not stuck with whatever you produced in the moment of disruption. So, this is probably going to be the first of maybe two um, discussions, video workshops around narrative strategies. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to writing narratives, and there's just no way we can cover it all, even in the span of, I would say, a semester. But I want to try and hit upon some of the key strategies of personal narratives in particular that we can sort of touch upon and then hopefully have a discussion about in the video workshop itself, this video workshop, and then use as methods to build from here. You'll notice there's also, though, keep in mind, there's also a narrative toolkit uh, course document that's in on the modules page in the course documents module, and there's a lot more information there about all kinds of strategies that maybe we're just not going to have time to touch upon. So without any further ado, speaking of time, let me get straight away to the discussion for today, and that requires me to share my screen. Hopefully I can get this to work appropriately. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. Uh, Narrative strategies. So one thing that we should, I mean, in my opinion, one thing that we should always ask ourselves in any kind of learning situation is, why are we doing this? Why might this be valuable, right? Probably very few of us are pursuing professions in which we're going to be required to or asked to write personal narratives. But so, what might be the value of developing personal narrative skills? Well, in many ways, it's more than just a matter of genre, right? It's more than saying, well, I have in my pocket strategies for writing fiction or writing nonfiction for that matter, writing a narrative. It's more than that. Storytelling, in many ways, is a skill. It's also a strategy, and it's also a sort of ethics. What I mean by that is that it's storytelling allows us to render information as meaningful in a wide variety of contexts. In many ways, narrative is the way that we make meaning. I mean, think about when you tell your friends about what you did the past weekend, or think about when you first meet somebody and they ask you, where did you grow up? And you make meaning out of those experiences by telling stories about them. Also, storytelling and narrative skills feeds into creativity. It is about coordinating with others in many ways, not just because we're going to be doing peer review workshop and stuff, but you're also thinking about a reader, right? When I'm writing, and you're thinking about how what you're writing is making them feel and how you can use the writing as a way to move them in this direction or that direction or feel or think this thing or that thing. It also fosters critical thinking, right? Inevitably, when we write narrative or we use narrative, we spend a lot more time thinking about smaller moments that maybe we skip over, or we spend a lot more time thinking about moments and what we were feeling and what we were thinking in those moments once we have a little distance from them. It also is about emotional intelligence. Narratives are a great way to work through some of our own stuff, if you will, our own memories, our own lives. And it doesn't have to be something tragic or something negative or something harmful. Even understanding the sort of positives and the benefits that we get from certain aspects or events in our lives. So concomitant with that, of course, is improving critical thinking and writing, about engaging an audience and building relationships, creating empathy, right? It's a wonderful way, obviously, if I'm in a job interview, if I have good storytelling skills, I'll be able to, or even if I'm out on a date and I want to connect with somebody, or I want to, have a conversation with somebody so that they can have a sense of empathy about what it feels like to be somebody or something else. Storytelling skills are are very useful for that. They're also about developing your own individual perspective and viewpoint, enabling you to tell your own story. Um, and they're reinventive, and they can allow you to renew yourself, reinvent yourself. As we'll be talking about, when you write a personal narrative, you're really creating a character out of yourself, but you're also sort of thinking through your own experiences, your own or certain events in your own experience, and sort of, like I said before, taking meaning out of those so that you can learn from maybe some things that have happened in your life, but you can also perhaps see the silver lining in negative things, or you can see the downsides to things that you were wholly positive. You can better understand how things might have taught you this or that, better understand how these experiences shape us into who we are or the ways in which they impact us. Um, but also, like we talked about above, in terms of that emotional intelligence, it also can allow us to cope. It can allow us to achieve a sense of catharsis. It can allow us to move on if we can tell those stories. Okay, so let's get a little bit more pragmatic here by just, first of all, talking about what is a narrative, right? A narrative, by definition, is a spoken or written account of connected events, a story. Okay, so that's the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary definition. Um, that's obviously a very limited definition, but there are still some sort of key things that we can pull out of that. Number one is that it's a series of scenes that, in many ways, I think it's useful to think about narratives like movies, right? Movies aren't every single detail of a certain event shown, right? We jump from one scene to another scene to the next scene, right? So it's not just exposition, right? It's not just explanation, this and this and this and this. They're episodic and scene driven, and I'm choosing sort of different scenes to include and other scenes that don't need to be included. Um, they're also they have a sequence, right? So this idea of connected events, so there's a sequence of these scenes, and they don't necessarily have to be chronological. And we'll talk more about this in a second, right? There's a kind of way in which I can move those around or play with chronology or play with sequence, right? But there's also a kind of emotional arc to stories. And we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking both about narrative arcs and emotional arcs today, that we can think about. Also, um, there's also a matter of style and point of view and perspective, that it isn't just events, being watched via a video camera. We have a point of view. We can have a distinct voice or style. For example, if I'm multilingual, I can include, like maybe I speak one language at home and another language uh, in general public, and maybe I want to include some of those aspects of my culture, my background into my story. We can get really creative and develop kind of a sense of style and create that kind of character that is even embellished and even has some fictive or surreal elements, if we'd like. So there's a matter of style in writing that this definition really doesn't take hold of. Plus, style, scenes, and sequence all have the S in them, but I'm going to break that rule here in just a second. More germane to us is what is a personal narrative. And this is from the Writer's Guide. The Writer's Guide is a text um, that I'm going to be referring to. It's not a textbook that you had to buy for this course, but it is one that I'll be excerpting throughout this course. Um, but I'm going to read through this. I'm going to sort of skip through this as in the spirit of time. Right? A personal narrative is a form of nonfiction writing in which the author recounts an event or incident from their life. Personal narrative tells a story and often includes memories and anecdotes. An anecdote is sort of a short, amusing, or interesting story about something that happened in real life to relate events and ideas. Like all good writing, personal narratives have an overarching theme, which is a message you want to impart to your readers, and a purpose beyond the story itself. Now, one of the reasons I said let's just dive in and do it is I feel like if we think about these things before we write, we can sort of get ourselves stuck and we can get ourselves in trouble. Like, ooh, what's my theme? What's my purpose? Rather, just dive in and write. And then we can go back and start to figure those things out. I've always found as a writer that I operate a lot better. Usually, my best work, yes, it starts out as a seed of something that I just wrote down real quickly and was like, I'm not really sure what I was doing. I didn't know what it was going to become, right? Rather than a situation when it's like, okay, make sure you do A, B, C, and D. And what's my theme? What's my purpose here? Those things can, I think that's where sometimes writer block comes from. Um, you may write to relay an event, to teach a lesson, or to explore an idea. So that purpose can vary wildly. You may write to help provide relief from stages of deep emotion, to evoke an emotional response, or simply to entertain readers. Above all, a personal narrative tells about an individual's experience or a series of events in a way that emotionally engages readers. Uh, I'm sorry, I can't see behind the captions, but uh, it allows you to vividly share your experience. I don't know if I can move the captions here. Maybe I can. Oh, I can. That's good news. So I'm sorry. Experience a series of events in a way that emotionally engages readers. The more clearly and vividly you share your experience, the more likely your readers will be moved. So a couple things that I think are valuable to take away from this are this idea of theme, right? Um, you can now go back and look at your narrative, even if you're the moment of disruption post, even if you're not going to use it, and think about is there a theme there? That a lot of common themes in stories are a character versus a character, like me going to school and maybe I experienced a bully, or me against my brother. There's some sort of antagonist, or me against my boss, me against the authorities, or character versus self, right? Maybe it's a story about me battling an issue that I have with myself, right? And that could be something about, that could be either something, maybe I'm battling an illness that I have, maybe it's even just a battle with a bad habit that I have. It could be character versus nature, right? And that could be look at anything from, say, like the challenge of going through puberty or something like that, or even something like being in a natural or being in a certain environment. Doesn't have to be a natural environment in terms of the idea of mother nature, but maybe it's me and I've gotten lost in the city in my car, right? Or maybe it's character versus society. Am I battling some sort of, like, for example, maybe I really struggled with gender identity, and that's something what society dictates is what being a woman or being a man is supposed to mean. Or maybe it's the social issues that we face in regards to class discrepancy, right? Or lower class, middle class, upper class. Maybe it's the education, or maybe it's your character versus some sort of idea of fate or the supernatural, right? Maybe it's me struggling with, as we're going to see, as we just read, Langston Hughes' story is about a kind of character versus the supernatural or fate or this idea of God and religion. But also, fate could mean something like, maybe I was in the midst of I was in a terrible car crash, and it was sort of me against this moment that perhaps meant the end of my days. And so there was a kind of challenge with fate there. As far as what purpose means, I think it's just really what you want your reader to feel, realize, or understand, even implicitly. What do you want them to get out of this? And they give you a number of ideas there, but you know, I also think that's a question that's dangerous to try and figure out before you write anything. I think you go in think it's better to go in sort of without these things determined. And I think now that we've written that moment of disruption post, we can think about what might be the theme, what might be the purpose. And if I want to start a new narrative, I can with a different theme, different purpose. Or maybe it'll help me realize, oh, I think this is actually the theme. And then maybe this is what I'm trying to get out of this. Maybe I really want to get people to feel what it's like to be right from an immigrant family and the challenges that an immigrant family faces in our particular society. Um, so purpose is an interesting thing to think about, and it's also a good way to think about those things. And this is maybe something you could comment upon. Think about those things in relation to Langston Hughes' Salvation. So, what makes for an effective personal narrative is another question, right? The New York Times actually hosts a personal narrative contest yearly. And this is a statement that they put on there, right? The winners are selected because they had a clear narrative arc. Again, my image of myself is there. They have a clear narrative arc with a conflict and a main character who changed in some way. They artfully balanced the action of the story with reflection on what it meant to the writer. They took risks, like including dialogue or playing with punctuations, sentence structure, and word choice to develop a strong voice. So you're seeing these things of sequence, scenes, style, and perhaps most important, they focused on a specific moment or theme, a conversation, a trip to the mall, a speech tournament, a hospital visit, instead of trying to sum up the writer's life in 600 words. Right? A personal narrative is not an autobiography. It's not even really a memoir. Those things are usually much more elongated, right? An autobiography, obviously, you're telling the story of your life, at least up until whatever age you write your autobiography. Or a memoir is really usually focused upon a longer period of time. Here we're talking about that moment. A moment, yes, there might be scenes after that moment and scenes setting up and before that moment, but personal narrative is much more focused. The narrative arc, characters, conflict, transformation, taking risks, being playful, being inventive, that notion of style, and also this idea of a balance of action and reflection, right? That it does have some sort of takeaway, it does have some sort of purpose, and it also has that sense of focus. Okay, so one thing I wanted, since what got mentioned there was narrative arc, how do we build a narrative from here? Sorry, the slide was messed up there. It got my transitions wrong. But the most conventional narrative arc is what you see in front of you here with this image, right? That we begin with a sense of exposition, or I think I called it setup or introduction in our moment of disruption. Then we have this moment of climax. I'm going to just point out the three main points: exposition, climax, and then resolution. But there's often things in between these things, right? Yes, the exposition setup, but maybe there's an initial incident that's sort of the very first point of conflict, where you suddenly find yourself in a scenario that's going to lead to a conflict. And then there's some rising action. They say here, I mean, I would three major events. I don't understand. I don't that number seems really arbitrary to me, especially for our purposes here. Just maybe an event or two that adds suspense or tension to that climax. And the climax, of course, is that moment of disruption happening. And then following action, events that unravel the conflict between the protagonist and antagonist that lead to the resolution. The resolution is where the conflict is resolved. It doesn't have to be resolved. And then we see what it means to the protagonist. And the denouement, which is a French word that I'm pronouncing terribly, is kind of the tying up of loose ends. But you can just get a sense of this narrative arc of setup, conflict, and then some sort of resolution. And again, it's interesting to think about this idea of a narrative arc in terms of how, not only how you can think about that in terms of our own stories. So what do you feel represents right now in your moment of disruption post? You, that first paragraph is kind of the exposition where I asked you to try and produce some exposition. The second paragraph is perhaps the conflict, the climax. And the third paragraph is perhaps something like the resolution and denouement. So we can think about those things and maybe even start to categorize those things in that way. And we'll also think about these things in relation to Langston Hughes's story Salvation. The other thing to think about in terms of building your narratives is sequencing, which is different from, we talked a little bit about before, but it's different from this idea of an overall narrative arc. Sequencing is about how your story plays with space and time. So there's obviously the most familiar form of sequencing. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's useful because it's the way we experience life. Sequencing is chronological, right? Beginning, middle, end, young to older, before, moment, after. I even asked you to kind of stick to, at this point, a chronological sequence, the setup, the moment of disruption, the afterwards, the reflection. But you can think of many other ways to sequence your stories, and you start to notice this in all kinds of films. I bring up a lot of film metaphors because films is something that most people experience, perhaps more than reading. But reverse chronology, going from older to younger, like Benjamin Button, or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which goes back through a relationship from the point of breakup to the beginning. Um, Using flashbacks, right? There's a story by Tobias Wells called Bold in the Brain, which is a guy who walks into a bank and then the bank gets held up and he gets shot and he flashes back through his entire life, not his entire life, of course, but some key moments of his life. He sort of has this in the instance of the bullet going into his brain, he has this flashback that is sort of whatever, people say your life flashes before your eyes. It's a story of that. Or something like Pulp Fiction, a film that starts where it ends, or starts about 20 minutes before it ends, and then we see that scene come back up in the movie. Some other strange sequences are like Out and Back, which is something maybe that I've kind of made up. But I'm thinking kind of like a bass and guitar that, maybe you have something that's kind of like, let's say, right, there's this, the story is about me trying out for the basketball team, right? But then, so it starts off with a paragraph of me driving to the tryout. But then I go and I talk about something else. I talk about my relationship with my father. Then I get another scene about the next 10 minutes with the basketball tryouts, me showing up, meeting the other people who are trying out. It's really kind of awkward. Then the coach shows up. Then I go back and I talk about my relationship with my brothers and da 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 da. Da. Then it goes back to another scene of me trying out and maybe not being doing that well on a certain exercise during the try, whatever. So you get this idea of out and back. The reason I say bass and guitar is because oftentimes a bass and drums are holding a steady rhythm while the guitar is free to solo off and do its own thing. Kind of an in the meantime story is another way to think about it. You can also think about using timestamps or markers, right? Even like in the form of a diary or a journal, right? September 7th, 2023, right? Got home and was completely soaked in my own sweat, da da da, right? But I can use those kind of formats, things, play with form, which is the last one there. Write my story in the form of a letter, write my story in the form of a step by step program, in the form of a screenplay, in the form of seven deadly sins, if you will. And also think about point of view. Write my story, most familiar would be first person point of view, but I also think about second person, third person point of view, doing pronoun shifts, shifting tense, going from the present tense to the past tense, back to the present tense, even the point of view of an object, like a clock in the corner of my room that is telling the story. And then also think about depth, pacing, and timing. Um, which is really about like slowing things down. Like Italo Calvino uh, was really known in a lot of his stories for really going into depth, and wrote a story about a guy just staring at a wave and talking infinitely about one wave, right? And and it's slowly breaking and all that's happening in terms of the particles and blah 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 blah. or something like a montage, right? A lot of television shows these days, in order to wrap up, they show a montage of what all the different characters are doing, especially if it's a story that's about multiple characters. Have a montage of what all those characters are doing in that moment and how their day ends or whatever. So thinking about depth, pacing, and timing as well. So there's a lot of ways to play with sequencing that we can think about in terms of building our narrative out further. So looking at salvation, right? I'm not going to read through the story here, but I was just saying it could be interesting to think about salvation in terms of think about the different scenes here, right? You really get that sense of exposition in the first paragraph, right? There was a big revival in my Auntie Reed's church, so we know it's his family, and his Auntie Reed's family is very much involved with the church. Then we get to the actual day in the church, then we get into the details when what's happening in the church. Then we get him called forward to the church, um, and then of course we get the sense of the moment of when Jesus never came, and when he lies, and then we get the moment at home, which is kind of the reflection moment and the denouement, if you will. So just looking at salvation is we're going to use it as an example going forward, but there's multiple things that we can use that story for in order to better understand some of these concepts. So, one thing that I really want to think about is objectivity and subjectivity. And an easier way, perhaps, to think about these are outside writing and inside writing. I don't mean outside the house and inside the house. I mean, kind of when you're subjectively in a point of view and when you seem to be more involved with writing that's more involved with exterior description. So you could think of interiority and exteriority. But objective description just means descriptions that attempt to describe the world that in a way that's uncolored by personal opinion or emotion or point of view or perspective. A subjective description is when the writer's opinions or the character's opinions and emotions come through, right? So just generally speaking. So a very sort of objective description would be something that's like a very fact driven, say, newspaper article, right? On Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, sorry, I'm in the way again, my head. At 8:45 a.m. New York local time, One World Trade Center, the North Tower was hit by a hijacked 767 commercial jet airplane loaded with fuel for a transcontinental flight. Compare that to, say, a more editorial piece that's involving more of a subjective point of view. Incredulously, while looking out the window at the damage and carnage the first plane inflicted, I swear to you, I swear to you, I felt the vengeance and rage emanating from that plane. So, what I think is interesting here is that the objective writing, the exterior writing, if you will, and narratives use both of these things. Yes, it's a simplification. Oftentimes these things are combined, but narratives use both of these styles. So in the objective one, right, we have more just a description. It's like a sense of the setting, the outside world. And then that sets, like when we think about a scene, that has the effect of framing the world for the reader, while the emotions pull the reader into that frame because they pull us into a point of view, meaning they put us in somebody's brain, they put us in somebody's mind. So I wanted to take a look at these things in terms of Langston Hughes's story, Salvation, right? So, sorry, I'm gonna move this around again. Captions. I was saved from sin. So what I did is I took the first paragraph and then the last paragraph. Right? I was saved from sin when I was going on 13, but not really saved. It happened like this. There was a big revival at my Auntie Reed's church every night for weeks. There had been much preaching, singing, praying, and shouting. Some very hardened sinners had been brought to Christ, and the membership of the church had grown by leaps and bounds. And just before the revival ended, they held a special meeting for children, quote, to bring the young lambs to the fold, unquote. My aunt spoke of it for days ahead. That night, I was escorted to the front row and placed on the mourner's bench with all the other young sinners who had not yet been brought to Jesus. Then, jumping to the last paragraph, that night, for the first time in my life but one, for I was a big boy, 12 years old, I cried. I cried in bed alone and couldn't stop. I buried my head under the quilt so my aunt heard me. She woke up and told my uncle I was crying because the Holy Ghost had come into my life and because I had seen Jesus. But I was really crying because I couldn't bear to tell her that I had lied, that I had deceived everybody in the church, that I hadn't seen Jesus, and that now I didn't believe there was a Jesus anymore since he didn't come to help me. So, taking a look at these two paragraphs, I wanted to sort of color them according to this idea of objectivity and subjectivity. Again, it's a simplification, but I think it helps map and understand how writing works on us in terms of this idea of setting up a frame and pulling us into that frame, if you will. So, for me, in terms of the first paragraph, the only kind of real interiorized or subjectivized writing is that first line. I was saved from sin when I was going on 13, but not really saved. It happened like this. We have this sense of voice. We have this, remember, a sense of voice and addiction really allows for subjectivity, is one of the ways to bring subjectivity into writing. The rest of it is more exposition, right? There's a big revival at my Auntie Reed's church every night for weeks. There have been much preaching, singing, praying, sort of just describing what's going on. It's setting up the frame. The last paragraph almost is the inversion, complete inversion of that. The only part that I feel is not really subjective is she woke up and told my uncle I was crying because the Holy Ghost had come into my life and because I had seen Jesus. That seems to be just more pure description, though then again, I think this is something that he's pretending what happens. So most of it, right, is really emotional, right? Subjective writing tends to be far more emotional because you're placed inside a perspective, you're placed inside of a point of view. So it's an interesting inversion when we think about that. What moments in my story? Well, you got to have a frame, if you will. You've got to set something up in order to put your reader in it. So that's why we have that exposition and we have that kind of introduction, if you will, so that we can then set up a world or a frame, as I'm putting it, that people can be pulled into. So out of curiosity, I took the whole story and oh, I thought I had it here. Oh, well, I'll get to it in a second. So, how do we build our narrative from here? It's really about psychological realism, right? A lot of people are wondering, like, do I have to? Can I like embellish a little bit? Does it all have to be fact? And the more important thing, the thing that's far more important than fact, is authenticity. And by authenticity, I mean psychological realism, which is this is a quote from an article called "The Secrets of Storytelling." It can be found on Jeremy Shue is the author, HSU on the last name. You can readily find it on the internet. But whether fiction or nonfiction, a narrative engages its audience through psychological realism, recognizable emotions, and interactions among characters. So the most important thing isn't like, you've heard people say, well, it actually happened that way. But if it's so incredible, it just is not believable. It doesn't have the psychological realism. I understand that it's miraculous that, you broke up with somebody and you got in your car and your guy's song is playing on the radio. It's miraculous. And sometimes those things happen, but most often those things don't happen. Most often you break up with somebody, you get into your car and there's a commercial for the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man or baking biscuits. And that has more psychological realism or resonance, I believe, because it isn't sort of miraculous. It has more of a sense of authenticity, even if it's not exactly what happened, right? So there's a big revival at my Auntie Reed's church every night for weeks. There have been much preaching, singing, praying, and shouting. But I was really, yeah, but I was really crying because I couldn't bear to tell her that now I didn't believe in Jesus anymore since he hadn't come to help me. We have the kind of setup, right? We have the setup, framing the world for reader, and then pulling the reader into that frame, right? So the best stories do more than just present a believable picture. So you can be wild. I can do really surreal things as long as I have some sort of psychological real, some sort of authenticity in the emotions. That's what will actually captivate the audience, right? Whose emotions can be inextricably tied to those of the stories of characters. Such immersion is a state psychologists call narrative transport. So taking a look at, as I thought I was going to do earlier, I just highlighted, again, yellow is the sort of subjectivity, the interiorization, green is the exteriorization. If we take a look at Langston Hughes' story, a lot of the beginning, naturally, unsurprisingly, is about exteriorization and setup and exposition, right? Yes, we get a little bit of sense of character, but then when we get to the second half of the story, we get much more of that interiorization because Langston has put us in the world. We know where we are. We get the details of that world and what's going on. And now we can see that sort of character versus fate, right? Character versus the church, even in this second, we can see that in the story and how that interiorization takes place. And that the interiorization builds more and more as the story goes on. I'm not saying that's how all stories work. That's not what I mean. But I would certainly argue that you need both. You need to set up a world, place us in a world, place us even in a moment so that you can then pull us into that emotionally, get us to understand where we are before you can hook us emotionally. Something else that's important to think about here is details. And the power of narratives is the way in which they enact emotional responses from readers through the details of their characters, settings, scenes, and moments. So we all know, I think, that narratives need detail. And so what kinds of details? Well, the most familiar details are connected to the five senses. So the visual, oral, tactile, aromatic, and details of taste, if you will. But there's also other details we can think about here, right? Kinetic details, how something moves, silence, what is the stillness like? Spatial details, oops, extrasensory details, things that are beyond words, using metaphors and similes to create a sense of detail. Lists. We're going to take a look at some sort of lists, lists of detailed things that give a sense of a place. Diction and lexicon, the way people say things or the way a certain character speaks. Dialogue creates a sense of detail because, as we talked about before, when people talk or when people look at things from a certain point of view or a certain tone of voice or a certain lexicon or dialect, when people say things, we hear their voices in the air, if you will, and that gives a sense of detail. And we can also think about tonal shifts, right? Subverting expectations, right? Setting up a certain mood or vibe in a piece and shifting that tone by bringing in a different kind of set of details, or how things will look different if the character's mood changes, right? And showing that through detail. So details are really if you will, the bread and butter of narratives. I think I also said that about scenes and sequencing, but scenes are not effective without details, and scenes are most effective when they're sequenced powerfully. So details are really sort of get into the nitty gritty, and that is really where we also can they play a role both in exposition or exteriorization as well as interiorization. But more often, details allow for a sense of subjectivity within exterior description. And that's where we see those things combining. So one thing I think it's good to do as a writer is to map out all the different scenes that I have and then try and really open them up and think about what are the different details there. It's not that you need to have all five senses of details in each scene, no. But a lot of times it's good to have more, and then you can select which ones you think are most impactful or most meaningful from. So this is just a diagram that shows, like, take that scene or that moment from the story and really open it up. What are the things that the character sees? What are the things that the character might smell? What are the things the character might touch? What are the things that the character might taste, even if it just means like this kind of really, the taste of blood in one's mouth or the taste of nothing in one's mouth? What are the things that might be heard in that scene? And again, it's not that you need all those things in every single scene, but really opening up that scene and finding what are the things that I think really help establish the vibe and mood of that moment or that scene. So this, of course, well, not of course, but you might be wondering, why the heck did you show us that truck stop scene? And one reason is because it comes from a film that's a story about a musician. So that probably helps the scene make a little bit more sense in that this character, Glenn Gould was an actual pianist, classical pianist, um, is goes in this truck stop and he hears things differently than most people hears things, right? So he starts orchestrating the song out of this conversation. But for me, why I think the scene is meaningful or useful for us, not just for me, but hopefully for you as well, is that it goes to show that writing, there's a lot going on around us almost at all times in terms of details. Forgive me, I have a little bit of a cold. It's strangely enough in this heat wave, but it goes to show that there's all these details that go so that we filter out constantly, and that we could sort of once we start thinking about it, we could bring them into play in interesting and useful ways. So when do we bring the detail? Well, we bring the detail when we want to enact a sense of experience and create an impression upon our reader. Excuse me. So it allows us to provide a sense of immediacy. It allows for moment. We're going to bring detail in moments of transformation. It allows us. We want to bring detail for distinct or unique things to enact emotion, for that authenticity, that psychological realism, to tighten or develop setting, characterization, and or action, or when it makes too much sense or ties up too nicely. Like I was telling you, getting in the car and the song of the lover you just broke up with, your relationship song is on the radio. That's just a little too sentimental, too unreal, right? Inauthentic. So you want to nuance it. Um, but there's something else I think that's valuable to think about in terms of what details do in terms of somebody reading a story, right? So, and that's chronos versus kairos. You don't need to get overly complex with these terms. Chronos just means like chronology, a sense of time as moving forward, this, then this, and this, and this. We talked about that earlier. Kairos is more about a sense of immediacy, right? So you guys probably know this well. Like there's moments in your life, well, I'll only speak for myself, but there's moments in my life that stand out from the rest. Moments where I felt like the moment became super important or powerful. And there's other days in my life that are probably forgotten, long forgotten. Most days in my life, perhaps they're long forgotten. I don't mean to make this sound depressing, but whereas just life goes on, it moves forward, da da da, and then all of a sudden there'll be these sort of interruptions of immediacy of moments. And sometimes these moments stick with me for good reason. Sometimes these moments are very random. Like I'll remember really strange things, and having the sense of immediacy. So it's interesting to think about how details can interrupt, if you will. I mean, you can think about story. We talked about story about as a sequence of scenes, but we can also think about this notion of chronology being interrupted by immediacy, right? So this idea that, and some of those kairos moments might be bigger than others, right? So the inciting incident toward the beginning, and then or the setup and exposition, right? First walking into the church, right? Then the inciting incident when Langston Hughes gets called to the bench, right? And then the smaller detail of the preacher calling out to them, and the dialogue from the preacher, and then of course the climactic kairotic moment of immediacy where Langston Hughes is looking at I can't remember his name. I want to say it's Winston. I'm going to actually look at the moment in just a second, and how that's the big moment of conflict. And then of course we have perhaps a scene of falling action, a detailed scene. So details open up time in a very differential way than just chronology, if that makes sense. And that's, I think, an interesting way to think about it. You can think about a kind of rhythm of the story and pacing of the story. When I was talking about that notion of depth in terms of sequencing and timing, pacing, that's really what I'm thinking about in terms of chronos versus kairos. So this is that scene. It's Wesley. I said Winston, Wesley. Now it was really getting late. I began to be ashamed of myself holding everything up so long. I began to wonder what God thought about Wesley. This is that moment of climax, right? Who certainly hadn't seen Jesus either. but who was now sitting proudly on the platform, swinging his knickerbocker legs and grinning down at me, surrounded by deacons and old women on their knees praying. God had not struck Wesley dead for taking his name in vain or for lying in the temple. So I decided that maybe to save further trouble, I'd better lie too and say that Jesus had come and get up and be saved. So I got up. Notice that we have this is that moment of transformation. This is that moment of climax. But we also have this sense of immediacy, sitting proudly on the platform, swinging his knickerbocker legs and grinning down at me. That is this detail that really opens up that moment, right? Where you're stuck in that moment. And that also starts to build this emotion. So to provide that sense of immediacy for those moments of transformation, I want to really detail those out. Or this time as I walked to the oratory final, different story here. This time as I walked to the oratory final, I did so by myself, as I had finally acquired the self-assurance needed to navigate the quiet hallways of the high school. I could only hear the heels of the two girls behind me. The way in which this really sets up a sense of setting and a sense of mood, the detail of the heels of the two girls behind me, the hallway, really get a sense of that high school hallway and how empty it is, as well as the character's mood from that particular detail. Going back to the story of salvation, a great many old people came and knelt around us and prayed. Old women with jet black faces and braided hair, old men with work gnarled hands. You get a sense of this community. You get a sense of the people of the church, of the congregation, just from those specific details. It allows for this characterization, right? It allows for developing a sense of setting as well. So I want to take a look at some longer examples of this. Of course, we just looked at the example of, that truck stop scene is called Truck Stop. So it isn't, I mean, this may seem a small thing, but it's really that we're able to get really a sense of that place just from the conversations and the different kinds of accents and the diction and tones of voice that are happening within that place. The detail of all those things is all establishing a real sense of mood within that place. But taking a look at some more written examples, I'm going to jump ahead actually in the spirit of time. This is from The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, which some of you may be familiar with. I'm going to have to move some things around in order to read these things, but this is where we use details, or Tim O'Brien, I should say, uses details to characterize people, but also give us a sense of this, right? He's writing about experiences in the Vietnam War that get us a sense of who are these people he's in the war with, their particular platoon. So the things they carried were largely determined by necessity. Among the necessities or near necessities were P-38 can openers, pocket knives, heat tabs, wrist watches, dog tags, mosquito repellent, chewing gum, candy, cigarettes, salt tablets, packets of Kool-Aid, lighters, matches, sewing kits, military payment certificates, sea rations, and 2 or 3 canteens of water. Together, so that's what everybody has, right? Those details almost give us a sense of the place, the moment, what it's like to be there. And then we get more specifics of certain characters and the specific things they carried. So together, these items weighed between 15 and 20 pounds, depending upon a man's habits or rate of metabolism. Henry Dobbins, who was a big man, carried extra rations. He was especially fond of canned peaches and heavy syrup over pound cake. Dave Jensen, who practiced field hygiene, carried a toothbrush, dental floss, and several hotel-sized bars of soap he'd stolen on R&R in Sydney, Australia. Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside the village of Thon Kay in mid-April. So here we have this characterization as well. We have a sense of the setting through the details and these lists of details, and then also a sense of these individual characterizations of Henry Dobbins, Dave Jensen, and Ted Lavender. Just to give a few more from some of the moment of disruption stories in terms of characterization, my father would become the clear vision of a cartoon character with his beet red face and steam coming out of his ears whenever my brother did something that did not meet our father's expectations. So that detail, becoming a cartoon character, the beet red face, the steam coming out of his ears, really does some wonderful work in terms of characterizing the father. The smell of fresh baked cookies and blueberry muffins from the cafe linger in the halls, and from elderly patients chatting with the nurses warmed my heart and calmed me down for the time being. Right. This is the setting of a hospital, right? And how those fresh baked cookies, the blueberry muffins, those details not only engage us sensorially, but they also connect to us emotionally, right? Usually when we're in a hospital, we're not smelling those things, right? And here we have this experience being played out through those details or enacted and developed. The one last thing I wanted to talk about was this kind of strange category about when it ties up too nicely. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in another video when we talk about developing the kind of reflections or the resolutions, the takeaways to our stories. But when it makes too much sense or ties up too nicely, things like I thought of was like the deer, the symbol of the deer, the detail, the image of the deer throughout the film Get Out. I didn't even really notice it when I watched the film, but um, the deer plays a huge role throughout the film. It turns out that the main character's mother was victim of a hit and run, and then, of course, the main character, when he's on the way to his girlfriend's house, um, ends up hitting, I can't remember if she's driving or he's driving, ends up hitting a deer, and they kill the deer on the way up the road, which is another kind of hit and run, if you will. But then at the end, the deer there's multiple other moments where the deer comes to represent the father, the racist father of the girlfriend, right? Talks about how he hates deer, they're invading. So the deer becomes a kind of metaphor for African Americans in the film, and how African Americans in our society are constantly dehumanized and horrifically dehumanized, and how white supremacist culture and racist culture um, um, uses all these stereotypes to dehumanize African Americans. And that is captured. It'd be one thing to sort of just have a character just come out and say that directly, right? You notice, I don't think the father character is saying, but we understand what he's talking about when he's talking about the deer, and it's super disturbing. I believe also that the main character, in a moment of kind of reversal, kills that father, the white supremacist father, with the deer head. I believe, if I remember right. Another example of this would be in the movie Boys in the Hood from, I don't know, guys probably haven't seen Boys in the Hood, but filmed by John Singleton in the, I think, the early 90s, 1992 maybe, which is about um, the gangs in South Central Los Angeles. One of the first shots in the film just is the stop sign. And it's like there's a loud, like, and then we just get this image of the stop sign, and then it moves on. And it's sort of like the stop sign represents in many ways the kind of theme, if you will, of the movie. Like, I mean, prior to this, it does get set up. Prior to this, John Singleton, or the filmmaker, quotes how 1 in 5 African Americans growing up in Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, will die, and their lives will be taken by a fellow African American. And then we get the stop sign. So instead of sort of preaching out and saying, let's stop killing ourselves or stop killing one another, uses this detail, this image of the stop sign. And it's that much more powerful, and it's that much more, it has nuance rather than sort of preaching at us, if you will. And it doesn't create this kind of sense of cliche or sentimentality. So that's one of the challenges that we're going to face. We'll talk about it later, but that's one of the challenges we'll face when it comes to the reflections in our narratives. In the meantime, that's the end. I'm going to go ahead and sign off because this is a lot longer than I wanted it to be, but I wanted to cover as much ground as I could in terms of giving us some ideas about narrative strategies. I look forward to the conversation, and I'll see you again next time. Take care.